All right, hardcore college football fans, get your calculators out, get your abacuses, your fingers and toes, whatever you need. We are going on a bit of a math course, crunching numbers, looking at results, putting them into context. This is going to be a workshop, so get yourself settled. We are taking all the numbers, all the comparisons, everything that we put together regarding the conference comparisons, the results on the field between the Power 5 conferences in 2018, and here it is, our final results. And I could see no other way to do it than to really just roll up our sleeves and just dig into the numbers and the results and try to make sense of it. So we have produced 6 videos. So an introductory video in which we presented our formula of presenting the results from 2018 between the Power 5 conferences and giving context to each game. Seeding all the conferences, check out the video, seeding all the conferences, and then that gives real weight to the results. So, for example, when Clemson beats Alabama in the national championship game, that's a 1 seed in the ACC, defeating the 1 seed in the SEC. That's an evenly matched game. So, since there are 14 teams in 3 of the 5 conferences, we gave 14 points to each game to start. 14 seeds, 14 points per game. It makes complete sense. That's where we start. So if a 1 seed beats a 1 seed or a 5 seed beats a 5 seed, that's a 14-point win for the conference that won the game. It's a 14-point deduction for the losing conference. But if there's an imbalance, Alabama beat Louisville this year. Alabama's the 1 seed in the SEC. Louisville was the absolute worst team in the ACC at 0-8. They were the 14 seed. So take away the 13 seed difference away from the Alabama win. The SEC still gets credit for 1 point, but the ACC only gets discredited 1 point or a negative 1 point for the loss, and so forth. Check out the videos. Therefore, we put a point total on the results and the play and performance of every conference against the other 4 conferences for 2018. Forget the conference games because every conference went 500 against itself, of course. We're comparing the conferences in how they played against each other. All right, is it a perfect formula? No, it does not take into consideration that some games were played the first week of the season, and by the end of the season, they were completely different teams at that point. You can't make that judgment. You have to go with the results and not try to figure out, okay, how much better was this team at the end of the season than they were at the beginning of the season. This is also not a comparison of how the teams finished the season. This is a look at the entirety of the 2018 season. So a game in September is just as valid as a game in December or in the postseason. And a game against Rutgers and Kansas. The Rutgers-Kansas game counted just as much as the Clemson-Alabama game. Well, in actuality, obviously, the Clemson game over Alabama to win the national championship was the most important game in college football this season. But as a performance evaluator, the Rutgers-Kansas game was given just as much weight. All games were equally weighted to start. The baseline was 14 points, and of course, the points were either added or deducted based on the seeding difference. And again, if you don't understand that, you got to go back and watch the other videos. Check out the ACC, the Big Ten, the SEC, the Big 12, and the Pac-12 individual videos. And then, of course, the introductory video in which I explain the process. It makes total sense. It's not flawless, but it makes sense. It doesn't take into consideration home versus road team either. It also doesn't take a score comparison into play. So, for example, Clemson beat Alabama 44-16. Decisive, dominating win from the second quarter on for the Clemson Tigers to win the national championship over Alabama. Okay, had Clemson won that game on a last-second field goal, 31-30, that game would have been weighted exactly the same. And I do, in this determination, believe that scores should go into play. But I'm not a mathematician, nor do I have 100 hours a week to figure out all the permutations of the calculation of score differentials and what they mean. So it's just based on results. Stanford beat Pitt in a bowl game 14-13. that was a toss-up. If you watch the game, that game could have gone either way. But all the points go in one direction. They go to Stanford in the Pac-12, and the loss of the game goes to the ACC. That's just one example of many. In a perfect world with a perfect system that could be computed, that 14-13 game would look different than had Stanford won the game 42-3. Again, so scores don't matter. We can't rate injuries. We can't rate how important the game was. We just take the results on the field. Okay, in that comparison, the SEC finished with 58.9 points. The Pac-12 was second at 10.6 points. The Big Ten was third with 5 points. Those are all on the plus side. On the negative side, the Big 12 finished fourth with negative 29 points, and the ACC was last at negative 70.7 points. Keep in mind, although there's a huge disparity in the point totals, that one game plays a huge factor in the swing of the points. So, for example, I mentioned the Stanford-Pitt game. It came down to the wire at 14-13. So Stanford, being the, I believe, 4 seed in the Pac-12, defeated the 3 seed in the ACC. And don't question me on the seeds. I explained those in the introductory video and the other videos as well. But the 4 seed Stanford beat the 3 seed in the ACC Pitt. So that's a 15-point win. 14 points, that's the baseline, plus a 1 seed difference for the Pac-12. And don't go into the decimal points. I did, so just trust me on that. So it's roughly a 15-point win for the Pac-12, and it's roughly, if you take the 14 points, a 15-point loss for the ACC. So let's say Pitt would have pulled out that game against Stanford. Instead of losing 14-13, Pitt would have won 14-13. Well, the ACC would not have not only made up those 15 points that they lost, they would have added an additional 15 points for the wins. So that's a 30-point swing for the ACC. So instead of negative 70, just based on that one Sun Bowl game, the ACC would have gone from negative 70 to just negative 40. And that's just one game. And the Pac-12 instead would have gone from plus 10, take off the 30 points, they would have gone to negative 20. So don't get wrapped up in the point totals. There's a great disparity there, and the swing of one game is huge. So games like Michigan State losing to Oregon 7-6, missing 2 field goals, getting 1 blocked, and having a trick play. Sure, credit Oregon and the Pac-12 with a win, but that's how close some of these conferences are in terms of rating the results. There aren't enough games played between the conferences to accurately assess the conferences based on the games against each other. Consider in all the games played, take the Pac-12 and playing 12 games by 12 teams, that's 144 games, and they play many of those games against each other, so they play about 110 to 120 games. The Pac-12 only played 19 games out of over 100 games. They only played 19 against the other 4 leagues. They played none against the SEC. That is what's ridiculous about college football. The SEC and the Pac-12, being 2 of the major conferences, did not play 1 game against each other this season. The SEC played all these games, 14 teams playing 12 regular season games, plus all those postseason games, plus conference playoff games in the national championship, and only played 24 games against the other 4 leagues. So there are not enough games against each other. We also included Notre Dame, BYU, and Army. That was a judgment call. We left out the other independents and considered them UMass, New Mexico State. Those teams, Liberty, we considered them to be group of 5 teams. That was a judgment call on my part. BYU, we considered to be, I believe, a 9 seed, Army a 5 seed, and Notre Dame, based on their undefeated schedule against a Power 5 schedule, a 1 seed at 12-1 as they finish the season. All right, let's get to it. Just sheer record out of conference. The SEC went 56-12. That's an 82% winning percentage. Then the ACC went 43-23. These are all games against the Power 5, the Group of 5, and the FCS. The ACC at 43-23, they won 65% of their games. The Big Ten went 33-18 with a 64% winning percentage, just slightly below the ACC. The Big 12 won 72% of its games at 26-10, and the Pac-12 was the bottom team at 628 winning percentage at 27-16. Against the Power 5, the SEC went 14-10. That's a 583 winning percentage. Then the Big 10 came in next at 12-11, winning 52% of its games. The Big 12 was next at 9-9, winning, of course, 50%. The Pac-12 was 9-10, 47% winning percentage against the other four conferences. Then the ACC at 9-18, winning only 1/3 of its games. All right. Against the Group of 5, the SEC was dominant, 25-2. Consider this: the SEC took care of business against the lesser foes, 25-2. That's very impressive considering what the other four leagues did. The other four leagues tripped up at times against the Group of 5. Against really good Group of 5 teams like a Pitt losing to a UCF. No shame in that, except they got blown out by 31 points as the Coastal Division champion, so that does not look good for the ACC. But consider the only 2 losses for the SEC against the Group of 5 came by their worst team, Arkansas, losing to Colorado State and North Texas. Otherwise, the SEC was perfect, 25-0 against the Group of 5. That is only one indicator of how good the SEC was this season. The ACC went 19-4. The Big 10 went 17-6. The Big 12 went a perfect 10-0 against the Group of 5, including an Oklahoma State win over Boise State. And the Pac-12 showed some of its weakness here, going just 9-6 against the Group of 5. All right, let's dig in some more. Stay with me here. I told you it's going to be like a workshop, so this is not going to be perfect. The SEC went 6-4 against the ACC. They went 4-1 against the Big 10. Did not play the Pac-12. That's ridiculous. Went 3-4 against the Big 12. So the SEC at 14-10. Do not add up those records because they're not going to exactly equal the overall record because, again, we include Notre Dame, BYU, and Army. The Big 12 went 9-9 against the other four conferences, 4-3 against the SEC, 1-3 against the Big 10, 0-2 against the ACC, 3-1 against the Pac-12. Let's not get hung up on those records because during bowl season, the matchups are typically fair, but during the regular season, they're not. Oklahoma matched up against UCLA, one of the worst teams in the Pac-12. Oklahoma by far the best team in the Big 12 at 9-1. So that's a win for the Big 12. It's a loss for the Pac-12. But those two conferences only played 4 games, and that was one of them, and it was a mismatch. So we got to put the games into context. All right, for the Big 10, they went 12-11. That's 1-4 against the SEC. It's 5-1 against the ACC, and those were like-seeded matchups, so they meant something. And if anything, lower seeds in the Big 10 beat higher seeds in the ACC. The Big 10 went 3-1 against the Big 12 and 3-3 against the Pac-12. All right, the ACC did not play well. But we're going to see where the ACC did play a very difficult non-conference schedule, mostly by Clemson going out there and playing, of course, when it was all said and done, Alabama, Notre Dame, South Carolina, and Texas A&M. But the ACC went 4-6 against the SEC, 1-5 against the Big 10, 2-0 against the Big 12, and 0-2 against the Pac-12. And, of course, outside of the playoff game, Clemson-Notre Dame, the ACC got whitewashed by the Irish at 0-5, so that didn't help the cause. 0-5, excluding the Clemson win over Notre Dame. Then the Pac-12 at 9-10 did not play the SEC, 3-3 against the Big 10, 2-0 against the ACC, and 1-3 against the Big 12. Let's look at big wins. I'm talking about big games, big matchups. Who did well? Let's go through it. The Pac-12 really didn't win a big game. Just did not win a big game out of conference. They just didn't. Probably the biggest win for the Pac-12 was Arizona State beating Michigan State, which we thought was significant in September. It turned out to be a 7-6 Michigan State team. Probably the best wins for the Pac-12 out of conference. So they did go 9-10, which isn't awful, but to put their wins into context, they didn't really beat anyone good. The best team that they beat was most likely Iowa State. So it took the second best team in the Pac-12, Washington State, to defeat Iowa State in a very close Alamo Bowl, 28-26. So that does not bode well for the Pac-12, even though they fared well, pretty well in my metrics, going 9-10 against the other four leagues. Consider best win for the Pac-12 was over Iowa State, 28-26, by Washington State, the number 2 seed in the conference. Otherwise, best win was probably the 2 wins by Arizona State and Oregon over Michigan State. So those are the best teams that the Pac-12 beat out of conference. Michigan State twice and Iowa State. And then you would have to say Pitt. Those were the best wins out of conference by the Pac-12. All right. Those are big wins. Okay, big losses. I'm not talking about bad losses here. I'm just talking about big games, big matchups. Remember week 1, Washington, who ended up winning the Pac-12, going to the Rose Bowl, losing to Auburn. Auburn finished 3-5 in the SEC as the 10 seed in the SEC. Bad loss and big loss for the Pac-12. They lost big games with Washington losing to Ohio State in the Rose Bowl. USC lost to Notre Dame and Texas. As it turned out, USC was not very good with only 5 wins, but they lost the 2 big matchups to Notre Dame and Texas. Big bowl loss for Utah as the number 2 seed, losing to the 2 seed in the Big Ten in the Holiday Bowl as Northwestern came back from 20-3 down to win 31-20. So big loss for Utah and the Pac-12 against the Big Ten. And going 9-6 against a group of 5, not good for the Pac-12. Arizona lost to Houston, UCLA lost to Fresno State and Cincinnati. Fresno State also beat Arizona State in the Las Vegas Bowl. Arizona State lost to San Diego State. Too many group of 5 losses for the Pac-12. Going just 9-6 against against the group of 5. Not good for the Pac-12. All right. When we go to the Big 12, big wins for the Big 12. Texas beating Georgia. Huge win. Don't care what anybody says about the relevance of the bowl game or who was motivated or who had incentive. They were scheduled to play. And Texas whipped Georgia. Big win for the Big 12. Oklahoma State as a 9-point underdog and 3-6 in the Big 12, defeating an SEC team in Missouri in their bowl game. That's a big win for the Big 12 as well. Other than that, it's difficult to find big non-conference wins for the Big 12. They beat Rutgers, Vanderbilt, Cal, Tennessee, USC, who was down, of course, and UCLA. Outside of the Texas-Georgia game, who's the best team that the Big 12 beat? Cal, Vandy, probably Missouri. That was the best team that the Big 12 beat in going 9-9 against the other 4 conferences. Okay, big game losses. Obviously, it doesn't get much bigger than a college football playoff game. Oklahoma, the 1 seed, losing to the 1 seed Alabama out of the SEC. Okay, in terms of bad losses, Texas, the 2 seed, participant in the Big 12 championship game, losing to lowly Maryland out of the Big 10. You can say it's a fluke. It happened. It happened 2 years in a row. Texas lost to Maryland. That's a bad loss for the conference. Iowa State losing to Iowa is not an awful loss, but it's a big game loss where the Big 12 served up its number 3 seed, Iowa State, against the number 8 seed in the Big 10, and they lost head-to-head 13-3. And West Virginia, even though there are some conditions on this game in losing to Syracuse in the bowl game with no Will Grier, losing 2 of its top 3 wide receivers and its left tackle, they did lose. We can only go with the results. West Virginia losing to Syracuse is not a bad loss, but it's a big game loss. When I say big game, I mean top-seeded teams, high-seeded teams in each conference playing each other. So that's West Virginia, the number 4 seed in the Big 12, losing to the number 2 seed, Syracuse, out of the ACC. Okay. In the group of 5, against the group of 5, the Big 12 went 10-0. 2 nice wins here. Oklahoma State defeating Boise State, who went 10-3, finished in the top 25. And, of course, Texas Tech defeated Houston, who was a decent team at 8-5. The one FCS loss, Kansas, are we surprised? They lost to Nicholls State. All right, the ACC, 9-18. So the results, if we just go by the records, the ACC was the worst conference. But there's more to it than that, of course. The ACC is a one-team conference right now. Go to the second-best team in the ACC, and how good are they? Who is the second-best team in the ACC? Well, based on the results in 2018, it's Syracuse. 6-2 in the conference, 10-3 overall, beat a good West Virginia team in the bowl game, lost to Notre Dame 36-3. So they didn't just lose to Notre Dame, they got pasted by Notre Dame. And so who did Syracuse beat that was any good? West Virginia, missing 5 of its best players. So who's the next best team in the ACC? Pitt? That's what the record would say. It's 6-2 in the ACC. Well, they got murdered by Penn State by 45 points. They lost by 31 points to UCF. They lost their bowl game to Stanford. All right. The ACC would have been just completely annihilated in every conceivable metric and evaluation here if it weren't for Clemson. And secondarily, guess who? Who helped out the ACC more than any other team outside of Clemson this year in these conference comparisons? Duke! Duke beat Northwestern, the number 3 seed in the Big 10. Duke beat Baylor, the number 6 seed in the Big 12. And Duke beat Army, who we judged as a 5 seed at 11-2. Duke, 3-0 against the Power 5. Otherwise, it's all Clemson. Clemson beat Alabama, beat Notre Dame, so they beat 2 1 seeds. They beat Texas A&M, a really good team, as a 6 seed in the SEC, and they beat South Carolina, a 9 seed in the SEC. Otherwise, we mentioned the Syracuse win over West Virginia, which is a bit tainted, but they played. They beat them. Otherwise, Virginia with a nice win against South Carolina. But still, even though they were an underdog, according to Vegas in that game, Virginia was the 6th seed in the ACC, and South Carolina the 9 seed in the SEC. So the ACC won those 9 games, but Clemson won 4 of them. 4 of 9. Duke won 3, and then Syracuse and Virginia won the other 2 games. The other 10 teams in the conference could beat nobody outside the conference. 10 teams in the ACC beat no one. All right, the losses. I'm not going through 18 losses, but they lost 5 times to Notre Dame. So they lost to good teams. Consider they lost to Notre Dame 5 times. They also lost to a good Texas A&M team. They lost to Florida. They lost to Alabama, of course. They lost to Penn State and Stanford. They lost to Georgia and to LSU. Okay, big game losses for the ACC. Syracuse lost to Notre Dame. NC State losing to Texas A&M. That's a huge loss for the ACC in regards to the look of the game. NC State losing to Texas A&M as a 7-point underdog, no surprise to me, but I ran with that pick. Texas A&M slaughtered NC State 52-14. Awful performance by the ACC. Georgia Tech, the 5 seed in the ACC, lost to the 10 seed in the Big Ten, Minnesota, by 24 points. That's an awful loss. Miami lost to Wisconsin by 32 points. That's atrocious. Virginia, who finished 8-5, won a bowl game in the ACC, lost to Indiana, who went 2-7 in the Big Ten. That's an awful loss. Virginia, the 6th seed in the ACC, losing to the 12 seed in the Big Ten. So the ACC did have some bad losses. Okay, of course they had big wins, and they were all by Clemson. Clemson beat Alabama, Notre Dame, Texas A&M, and South Carolina. And other than that, Duke with a nice win against Northwestern. Credit the ACC there. It was only 1 win against the Big Ten's 5 wins. And Virginia over South Carolina, nice win for the ACC. Okay, against the group of 5, the ACC went 19-4. Didn't have any really substantial wins, but these are decent wins, okay wins to their credit. Miami beat Toledo. Virginia beat Ohio. Florida State beat Northern Illinois. But really, and Duke beat Temple in the bowl game, but really the best win in the group of 5 category for the ACC was Wake beating Memphis in the Birmingham Bowl. Group of 5 losses, there were some embarrassments here, of course. Nothing could top Virginia Tech losing to ODU. And then also North Carolina getting blasted by East Carolina, a 3-9 team out of the American Conference. That's not good. Georgia Tech lost to South Florida, who only finished at 7-6. All right. Let's move it along. Big Ten, we mentioned 12-11 against the Power 5. The really big wins, Ohio State beat Washington in the Rose Bowl. Penn State is a 4 seed, beat Pitt, a 3 seed, and they beat them by 45 points. Indiana, we mentioned, beating Virginia as a 12 seed over a 6. Minnesota as a 10 seed beat Georgia Tech as a 5 seed. Maryland, the 11 seed, beat Texas, the 2 seed in the Big 12. So the Big Ten won a lot of low-seeded games over high-seeded teams in other conferences. Iowa over Iowa State. Okay. Iowa beat Mississippi State. Good team in the SEC. Okay, those are big and surprising wins for the Big Ten, beating higher seeds. Okay, bad losses for the Big Ten. Michigan losing to Notre Dame and Florida. Not embarrassing because those are really good teams, but they got blasted by Florida. Michigan State losing to Arizona State and Oregon. Both close games, but they lost the games. Penn State losing to Kentucky. That would have been a huge swing for the Big Ten against the SEC. And, of course, the embarrassing showing by the Big Ten in the postseason was Purdue getting annihilated, whipped, butt kicked, blasted, annihilated, wiped off the field 63-7 to Auburn. Okay, group of 5, nice showings by the Big Ten. And these are expected. They should beat these teams, but let's still give them credit, as we are with every conference. Michigan State beat a good Utah State team. Penn State held off a good App State team that won the Sun Belt. Minnesota beat Fresno State, who won the Mountain West Conference and beat Arizona State and UCLA. And Iowa beat Northern Illinois. Okay, the Big Ten, probably more than any other conference, had some bad group of 5 losses. Consider Rutgers lost to Buffalo. Illinois lost to South Florida. Nebraska lost to Troy. Maryland lost to Temple. Northwestern lost to Akron. 4-8 Akron. Purdue lost to Eastern Michigan. Bad losses by the Big Ten against the group of 5, even though overall they fared okay against the group of 5 at 17-6. And finally, the SEC really didn't lose a bad game the whole season. Let that sink in, and I will show you. The SEC did not lose an embarrassing game. Consider Arkansas. Let's get them out of the way. Worst team in the conference? Yes, they count. They're a member of the SEC. They lost to Colorado State and North Texas. Nobody in the SEC or the Power 5 should lose to Group of 5 teams at that level. Colorado State went 3-9. North Texas was a decent team at 9-4, but still not an upper echelon Group of 5 school. And Arkansas lost to both of those teams. Okay, take Arkansas out of the mix. Again, the SEC went 25-0 against the Group of 5. So there you go. Those are the two bad losses. Otherwise, yes, Tennessee got blasted by West Virginia, but Tennessee went 2-6 in the SEC, and West Virginia was one of the best teams in the Big 12. Close to a top 10 team the entire season. All the SEC losses are understandable. Yes, the way Alabama lost the national championship game was embarrassing, getting blasted, losing after a 16-14 lead, giving up 30 consecutive points. Yes, it was embarrassing the way it happened, but of course losing to Clemson, a 15-0 team, not embarrassing. These are the losses by the SEC. Mississippi State loses to a good Iowa team. Georgia loses to Texas. That's a 2 seed against a 2 seed. I know it wasn't expected. Georgia was a double-digit favorite, but a 2 seed against a 2 seed. No shame in that. South Carolina, a 9 seed, losing to Virginia, a 6 seed. Missouri lost to Oklahoma State. They were like-seeded seeds. Like-seeded teams. Vanderbilt lost to Notre Dame by 5 points on the road. That's actually a good loss for the SEC. Vanderbilt lost to Baylor in a good bowl game by a touchdown. Down to the wire game. South Carolina lost to Clemson. Obviously, that should happen. The SEC did not lose a bad game. They did not have a bad loss. Again, the Arkansas 2 losses against the Group of 5 aside. Tons of good wins for the SEC. LSU beat Miami. Alabama beat Oklahoma. Auburn beat Washington. That's a 10 seed beating a 1 seed. Auburn beat Purdue and annihilated them again, as we mentioned. Ole Miss, a 12 seed in the SEC, beat Texas Tech. Mississippi State, Kansas State, a decent win. Texas A&M over NC State, a really good win for the SEC, especially in resounding fashion by 39 points. Florida beats Michigan. Again, we can't take into consideration who was missing the game. Karan Higdon, Rashawn Gary, etc. But the results are Florida, the 4 seed in the SEC, beat Michigan, the 2 seed in the Big Ten. Kentucky, really big win by the SEC here. Close game, competitive game. That doesn't come into play in these evaluations. But when we put it into context, sure. I take into consideration that Kentucky beat Penn State. 4 seed, 3 seed matchup there. And they won the game 27-24. Very close game. Good win for the SEC, but not an embarrassment for the Big Ten. They didn't lose 42-3. Missouri beat Purdue on the last play of the game. So Mizzou, 8-4 team in the SEC during the regular season, beats a 6-6 Purdue team on the last play of the game in West Lafayette, 40-37. So what does that tell us? That's what we would expect to happen when those two teams get together. There you go. All right. Next set of stats. Hang with me, baby. Here we go. The teams that the Pac-12 beat went 52-57. The teams that the Pac-12 beat in the other conferences went 52-57. They won 47% of their games. The teams that the Big 12 beat won 50% of their games, 57-57. The teams in the major conferences that the Big 10 beat went 85-62. They won 58% of their games. That means the Big 10 beat good teams. The ACC, listen to this, the teams that the ACC beat went 84-35. They won over 70% of their games. That's Clemson beating Alabama and Notre Dame. That's what that is. And also Texas A&M. and Duke beating Northwestern. But it's mainly Clemson beating Alabama and Notre Dame. Those are two teams that combined went 26-2. All right, and then finally, the SEC beat teams that went 94-84, won 53% of their games. Okay, the teams that the Pac-12 beat in conference, those teams won 49% of their games. The Big 12 beat teams that won only 37% of their games in conference. So why does that matter? Because your overall record could be puffed up by beating FCS and bad group of 5 teams. But the conference record, that's a closed experiment. That's a closed metric. So the Big 12 beat bad teams. They beat teams that only won 37% of their conference games. The Big 10 beat teams that won almost 55% of their conference games. The ACC beat teams that won over 63% of their conference games. And the SEC beat teams that went 500 against their conference. So the ACC looking good based on that metric. And, of course, it's a lot of Clemson right there. Okay, the Pac-12 lost to really good teams. They lost to teams that went 103-32. Well, that's Ohio State beating them twice. That's them losing to Notre Dame twice. So the teams that beat the Pac-12 won 76% of their games, 74% of their games in conference. Okay, the Big 12 lost to teams that won 70% of its games, 83-35, and 60% of its games in conference. The Big 10 lost to teams that won 64% of their games and only 45% of their games out of conference. So this is an interesting dichotomy in the Big 10 because they beat better teams than the games they lost. They beat Washington. They beat Utah. They beat Miami. They beat Mississippi State. They beat Texas. They beat teams that won 55% of their games in conference, but they lost to teams that only won 45% of their games. Do you see how strange that is? But that's basically Rutgers losing to Kansas and Nebraska losing to Colorado. That's what that is. That's also Purdue losing outside the conference to an Auburn team that only went 3-5 in the SEC. All right, the ACC, they lost to really good teams. The teams that the ACC lost to won 77% of their games, 59% in conference, which is really good. So that's Louisville losing to Kentucky and Alabama. That's Miami losing to LSU. And Georgia Tech lost to Georgia. That's Florida State losing to Florida. That's Syracuse losing to Notre Dame. That's Notre Dame beating the ACC 5 times. That's out of that 171-51, that's Notre Dame credited 5 times. So that's 12-1 times 5. That's 60-5. All right. Then finally the SEC, the games that they lost, the teams that beat them won 77% of their games. Well, they lost to Clemson 3 times. So that's Clemson getting credited at 15-0 3 times, 45-0. So that boosts that opponent's win percentage mightily. Clemson going 45-0. They beat Texas A&M, Alabama, and South Carolina. And the teams that the SEC lost to won 68% of their games in the conference. All right, one last metric to run by you. We talked about the Pac-12 having the worst record against the group of 5 at 9-6. They didn't even lose to good group of 5 teams. The group of 5 teams that the Pac-12 played in those 15 games only won 47% of their games. On the other hand, the Big 12 went 10-0 against the group of 5, and aside from the win against Boise State and a win against Houston, The Big 12 should have gone 10-0 against a group of 5 because they played teams that went 47-79. They played teams that only won 37% of their games. The Big 10, on the other hand, went 17-6 against a group of 5, and those teams won 51% of their games at 161 and 157. The ACC didn't play great group of 5 teams either. 133 and 136, less than 50%. And neither did the SEC at 47% winning percentage against the group of 5. What we need to take into consideration there is that a large portion of the group of 5's non-conference schedule, so most of the conference schedules for the group of 5 are 8 games, so they play 4 non-conference games. Well, they play 2 or 3 of those games against the Power 5, so they lose most of those games. If you add up all the Power 5 teams playing the group of 5, they win well over 80% of those games. Well over 80%. Let's see. $80 wins for the Power 5 against the group of 5. 80 wins, 18 losses. That's 80 and 18. That's about 81% winning percentage. There you have it. So really looking at this, the SEC won a lot of big games against like-seeded teams. They consistently won those games. They consistently beat down the group of 5, did not lose bad games. They did not have a bad loss outside of Arkansas, did not have any bad losses. Games in which high-seeded teams in the SEC lost to low-seeded teams elsewhere. They didn't lose big games. They didn't lose to like-seeded teams. So the SEC far and away, based on the metrics and the eyeball test and putting all of this into context, was the best conference. The SEC was number 1. The Big 10 is pretty much clearly the number 2 conference. If you really look at it, beating good teams, beating like-seeded teams, also beating teams that were higher seeded in other conferences, namely the ACC. When a 12 seed beats a 6 seed, a 10 seed beats a 5 seed, an 11 seed beats a 2 seed, an 8 seed beats a 3 seed. Consistently, the Big 10 was able to go outside the conference and beat teams that were supposed to beat them. The Big 10 did have a rough time against some group of 5 teams. Purdue losing to Eastern Michigan, Akron beating Northwestern. Those are not good signs for the Big 10. Those are bad losses. But overall, they had the 12-11 record against the other Power 5 leagues, and they won quality games. Okay, next we have the Big 12. The Big 12 is the 3rd best conference for 2018. They whitewashed the group of 5. They beat Houston and Boise State. They held up against the other conferences at 9-9. They held up well against the SEC, going 4-3 against the SEC. Oklahoma State with a big win against Missouri. Texas beat Georgia, of course. Baylor beat Vandy. Good showing by the Big 12 against the SEC. And yes, they only went 1-3 against the Big 10, but that was fairly understandable. They were pretty even matchups. TCU should lose to Ohio State, of course. So the Big 12, by every measurement, 72% winning percentage outside the conference, the number 3 conference in 2018. The number 4 conference, and this is actually a close call because if you take the depth of the conference, really look at it. After Clemson, what is the ACC? Syracuse is decent. North Carolina State is decent. They lost 52-13 to Texas A&M. If they would have lost that game 28-21, sure, I've got no issue with that. But Texas A&M's about the 15th best team in the country, and they lost by 39 points. And Syracuse lost to Notre Dame, the best team on its schedule outside of Clemson, by 33 points. So the ACC was Clemson And then Syracuse and NC State were barely top 25 teams. I don't care what their records were. They didn't beat anyone. They were barely top 25 teams. And then you had a bunch of teams 40, 50 in the nation. Duke, Georgia Tech, Miami, Wake, BC, in that range. After you get past Clemson, I would take that next rung of Pac-12 teams. Washington, Washington State, Oregon, Utah. Between Washington, Washington State, and let's take out Washington because they'll cancel out against Clemson. Clemson's much better than Washington, so take out Washington. But after Washington, Washington State, Stanford, Oregon, Utah, those four teams, matching them up against the next four in the ACC, I would go with the Pac-12. Despite that, on the strength of Clemson, improved Syracuse, I'm going to factor in that Pitt almost beat Stanford in a like-seeded bowl game. It's a tough call for me because I like the Pac-12 in the 2 to 5 seeds. I give the nod to the ACC at the top over the Pac-12 because the Pac-12 just did not play well against a group of 5. So, if we're going to give grades on a scale of 1 to 100, the SEC's an 85. The Big Ten's a 70. The Big 12's a 55. The ACC is a 40, and the Pac-12 is just below at a 35. That's all the work I can do, folks. Let me know where I missed it, and we will try to improve the process for next time. And we will try to get it done in under like 10 hours. Right here at MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share the videos to help us out and build the channel. And, of course, grab the Amazon link that you will find in the description section under this video and do your Amazon shopping. Forget the product. You don't have to buy the product, but please use the link to do your normal shopping at Amazon to help build this channel and keep it running right here at MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football. We will see you next time when we will rate the FBS teams from 2018, 130 all the way up to number 1. Then after spring practice, when I can evaluate personnel and consider personnel losses to the NFL and consider personnel gains through recruiting and early signees, I will rate the teams 130 to number 1 going into 2019. That's coming up next right here at MarkRogersTV, the voice of college football.